The Watcher by J.Sheridan Le Fanu and read by Christopher Halton. It is now more than 50 years since the occurrences which I am about to relate caused a strange sensation in the gay society of Dublin. The fashionable world, however, is no recorder of traditions. The memory of selfishness seldom reaches far, and the events which occasionally disturb the polite monotony of its pleasant and heartless progress, however stamped with the characters of misery and horror, scarcely outlive the gossip of a season, and, except perhaps in the remembrance of a few more directly interested in the consequences of the catastrophe, are in a little time lost to the recollection of all. The appetite for scandal or for horror has been sated. The incident can yield no more of interest or novelty. Curiosity, frustrated by impenetrable mystery, gives over the pursuit in despair. The tale has ceased to be new, grows stale and flat, and so in a few years inquiry subsides into indifference. Somewhere about the year 1794, the younger brother of a certain baronet, whom I shall call Sir James Barton, returned to Dublin. He had served in the navy with some distinction, having commanded one of His Majesty's frigates during the greater part of the American War. Captain Barton was now apparently some 43 years of age. He was an intelligent and agreeable companion when he chose it, though generally reserved and occasionally even moody. In society, however, he deported himself as a man of the world and a gentleman. He had not contracted any of the noisy brusqueness sometimes acquired at sea. On the contrary, his manners were remarkably easy, quiet, and even polished. He was in person about the middle size and somewhat strongly formed. His countenance was marked with the lines of thought, and on the whole wore an expression of gravity and even of melancholy. Being, however, as we have said, a man of perfect breeding, as well as of affluent circumstances and good family, he had, of course, ready access to the best society of the metropolis, without the necessity of any other credentials. In his personal habits, Captain Barton was economical. He occupied lodgings in one of the then fashionable streets in the south side of the town, kept but one horse and one servant, and though a reputed freethinker, he lived an orderly and moral life, indulging neither in gaming, drinking, nor any other vicious pursuit, living very much to himself, without forming any intimacies or choosing any companions, and appearing to mix in gay society rather for the sake of its bustle and distraction than for any opportunities which it offered of interchanging either thoughts or feelings with its votaries. Barton was therefore pronounced a saving, prudent, unsocial sort of a fellow, who bid fair to maintain his celibacy alike against stratagem and assault, and was likely to live to a good old age, die rich, and leave his money to a hospital. It was soon apparent, however, that the nature of Captain Barton's plans had been totally misconceived. A young lady, whom we shall call Miss Montague, was at this time introduced into the fashionable world of Dublin by her aunt, the Dowager Lady Rochdale. Miss Montague was decidedly pretty and accomplished, and having some natural cleverness and a great deal of gaiety, became for a while the reigning toast. Her popularity, however, gained her for a time nothing more than that unsubstantial admiration which, however pleasant as an incense to vanity, is by no means necessarily antecedent to matrimony, for, unhappily for the young lady in question, it was an understood thing that beyond her personal attractions she had no kind of earthly provision. Such being the state of affairs, it will readily be believed that no little surprise was consequent upon the appearance of Captain Barton as the avowed lover of the penniless Miss Montague. His suit prospered as might have been expected, and in a short time it was confidentially communicated by old Lady Rochdale to each of her 150 particular friends in succession that Captain Barton had actually tendered proposals of marriage, with her approbation, to her niece, Miss Montague, who had moreover accepted the offer of his hand conditionally upon the consent of her father, who was then upon his homeward voyage from India, and expected in 2 or 3 months at furthest. About his consent there could be no doubt. The delay, therefore, was one merely of form. They were looked upon as absolutely engaged, and Lady Rochdale, with a vigour of old-fashioned decorum, with which her niece would no doubt gladly have dispensed, withdrew her thenceforward from all further participation in the gaieties of the town. Captain Barton was a constant visitor as well as a frequent guest at the house, and was permitted all the privileges and intimacy which a betrothed suitor is usually accorded. Such was the relation of parties, when the mysterious circumstances which darken this narrative with inexplicable melancholy first began to unfold themselves. Lady Rochdale resided in a handsome mansion at the north side of Dublin, and Captain Barton's lodgings, as we have already said, were situated at the south. The distance intervening was considerable, and it was Captain Barton's habit generally to walk home without an attendant, as often as he passed the evening with the old lady and her fair charge. His shortest way in such nocturnal walks lay for a considerable space through a line of streets which had as yet been merely laid out, and little more than the foundations of the houses constructed. One night, shortly after his engagement with Miss Montague had commenced, he happened to remain unusually late, in company only with her and Lady Rochdale. The conversation had turned upon the evidences of revelation, which he had disputed with the callous scepticism of a confirmed infidel. What were called French principles had in those days found their way a good deal into fashionable society, especially that portion of it which professed allegiance to Whiggism, and neither the old lady nor her charge was so perfectly free from the taint as to look upon Captain Barton's views as any serious objection to the proposed union. The discussion had degenerated into one upon the supernatural and the marvellous, in which he had pursued precisely the same line of argument and ridicule. In all this, it is but true to state Captain Barton was guilty of no affectation. The doctrines upon which he insisted were in reality but too truly the basis of his own fixed belief, if so it might be called, and perhaps not the least strange of the many strange circumstances connected with this narrative was the fact that the subject of the fearful influences we are about to describe was himself, from the deliberate conviction of years, an utter disbeliever in what are usually termed preternatural agencies. It was considerably past midnight when Mr. Barton took his leave and set out upon his solitary walk homeward. He rapidly reached the lonely road with its unfinished dwarf walls tracing the foundations of the projected rows of houses on either side. The moon was shining mistily, and its imperfect light made the road he trod but additionally dreary. That utter silence, which has in it something indefinably exciting, reigned there, and made the sound of his steps, which alone broke it, unnaturally loud and distinct. He had proceeded thus some way, when on a sudden he heard other footsteps pattering at a measured pace, and, as it seemed, about 20 steps behind him. The suspicion of being dogged is at all times unpleasant. It is, however, especially so in a spot so desolate and lonely, and this suspicion became so strong in the mind of Captain Barton that he abruptly turned about to confront his pursuers, but though there was quite sufficient moonlight to disclose any object upon the road he had traversed, no form of any kind was visible. The steps he had heard could not have been the reverberation of his own, for he stamped his foot upon the ground and walked briskly up and down, in the vain attempt to wake an echo. Though by no means a fanciful person, he was at last compelled to charge the sounds upon his imagination and treat them as an illusion. Thus satisfying himself, he resumed his walk, and before he had proceeded a dozen paces, the mysterious footfalls were again audible from behind, and this time, as if with the special design of showing that the sounds were not the responses of an echo, the steps sometimes slackened nearly to a halt, and sometimes hurried for 6 or 8 strides to a run, and again abated to a walk. Captain Barton, as before, turned suddenly round, and with the same result. No object was visible above the deserted level of the road. He walked back over the same ground, determined that whatever might have been the cause of the sounds which had so disconcerted him, it should not escape his search. The endeavour, however, was unrewarded. In spite of all his scepticism, he felt something like a superstitious fear stealing fast upon him, and with these unwanted and uncomfortable sensations, he once more turned and pursued his way. There was no repetition of these haunting sounds until he had reached the point where he had last stopped to retrace his steps. Here they were resumed, and with sudden starts of running, which threatened to bring the unseen pursuer close up to the alarmed pedestrian. Captain Barton arrested his course as formerly. The unaccountable nature of the occurrence filled him with vague and almost horrible sensations, and yielding to the excitement he felt gaining upon him, he shouted sternly, "Who goes there?" The sound of one's own voice, thus exerted in utter solitude and followed by total silence, has in it something unpleasantly exciting, and he felt a degree of nervousness which perhaps from no cause had he ever known before. To the very end of this solitary street the steps pursued him, and it required a strong effort of stubborn pride on his part to resist the impulse that prompted him every moment to run for safety at the top of his speed. It was not until he had reached his lodging and sat by his own fireside that he felt sufficiently reassured to arrange and reconsider in his own mind the occurrences which had so discomposed him. So little a matter, after all, is sufficient to upset the pride of scepticism and vindicate the old simple laws of nature within us. Mr. Barton was next morning sitting at a late breakfast, reflecting upon the incidents of the previous night, with more of inquisitiveness than awe. So speedily do gloomy impressions upon the fancy disappear under the cheerful influences of day, when a letter just delivered by the postman was placed upon the table before him. There was nothing remarkable in the address of this missive, except that it was written in a hand which he did not know, perhaps it was disguised, for the tall narrow characters were sloped backward, and with the self-inflicted suspense which we so often see practised in such cases, he puzzled over the inscription for a full minute before he broke the seal. When he did so, he read the following words, written in the same hand. "Mr. Barton, late captain of the Dolphin, is warned of danger. He will do wisely to avoid Blank Street." Here the locality of his last night's adventure was named. "If he walks there as usual, he will meet with something bad. Let him take warning once for all, for he has good reason to dread. The Watcher." Captain Barton read and reread this strange effusion. In every light and in every direction he turned it over and over. He examined the paper on which it was written and closely scrutinized the handwriting. Defeated here, he turned to the seal. It was nothing but a patch of wax, upon which the accidental impression of a coarse thumb was imperfectly visible. There was not the slightest mark, no clue or indication of any kind, to lead him to even a guess as to its possible origin. The writer's object seemed a friendly one, and yet he subscribed himself as one whom he had good reason to dread. Altogether, the letter, its author, and its real purpose were to him an inexplicable puzzle, and one, moreover, unpleasantly suggestive in his mind of associations connected with the last night's adventure. In obedience to some feeling, perhaps of pride, Mr. Barton did not communicate even to his intended bride the occurrences which we have just detailed. Trifling as they might appear, they had in reality most disagreeably affected his imagination, and he cared not to disclose even to the young lady in question what she might possibly look upon as evidences of weakness. The letter might very well be but a hoax, and the mysterious footfall but a delusion of his fancy. But although he affected to treat the whole affair as unworthy of a thought, it yet haunted him pertinaciously, tormenting him with perplexing doubts, and depressing him with undefined apprehensions. Certain it is that for a considerable time afterwards he carefully avoided the street indicated in the letter as the scene of danger. It was not until about a week after the receipt of the letter which I have transcribed that anything further occurred to remind Captain Barton of its contents, or to counteract the gradual disappearance from his mind of the disagreeable impressions which he had then received. He was returning one night, after the interval I have stated, from the theatre, which was then situated in Crow Street, and having there handed Miss Montague and Lady Rochdale into their carriage, he loitered for some time with 2 or 3 acquaintances. With these, however, he parted close to the college, and pursued his way alone. It was now about 1 o'clock, and the streets were quite deserted. During the whole of his walk with the companions from whom he had just parted, He had been at times painfully aware of the sound of steps, as it seemed, dogging them on their way. Once or twice he had looked back in the uneasy anticipation that he was again about to experience the same mysterious annoyances which had so much disconcerted him a week before, and earnestly hoping that he might see some form from whom the sounds might naturally proceed. But the street was deserted. No form was visible. Proceeding now quite alone upon his homeward way, he grew really nervous and uncomfortable as he became sensible, with increased distinctness, of the well-known and now absolutely dreaded sounds. By the side of the dead wall which bounded the college park, the sounds followed, recommencing almost simultaneously with his own steps. The same unequal pace, sometimes slow, sometimes for a score yards or so quickened to a run, was audible from behind him. Again and again he turned. Quickly and stealthily he glanced over his shoulder almost at every half-dozen steps, but no one was visible. The horrors of this intangible and unseen persecution became gradually all but intolerable, and when at last he reached his home, his nerves were strung to such a pitch of excitement that he could not rest, and did not attempt even to lie down until after the daylight had broken. He was awakened by a knock at his chamber door, and his servant entering handed him several letters which had just been received by the early post. One among them instantly arrested his attention. A single glance at the direction aroused him thoroughly. He at once recognized its character and read as follows: "You may as well think, Captain Barton, to escape from your own shadow as from me. Do what you may, I will see you as often as I please, and you shall see me, for I do not want to hide myself as you fancy. Do not let it trouble your rest, Captain Barton, for, with a good conscience, what need you fear from the eye of the watcher?" It is scarcely necessary to dwell upon the feelings elicited by a perusal of this strange communication. Captain Barton was observed to be unusually absent and out of spirits for several days afterwards, but no one divined the cause. Whatever he might think as to the phantom steps which followed him, there could be no possible illusion about the letters he had received, and to say the least of it, their immediate sequence upon the mysterious sounds which had haunted him was an odd coincidence. The whole circumstance in his own mind was vaguely and instinctively connected with certain passages in his past life, which of all others he hated to remember. It so happened that just about this time, in addition to his approaching nuptials, Captain Barton had, fortunately perhaps for himself, some business of an engrossing kind connected with the adjustment of a large and long litigated claim upon certain properties. The hurry and excitement of business had its natural effect in gradually dispelling the marked gloom which had for a time occasionally oppressed him, and in a little while his spirits had entirely resumed their accustomed tone. During all this period, however, he was occasionally dismayed by indistinct and half-heard repetitions of the same annoyance, and that in lonely places, in the daytime as well as after nightfall. These renewals of the strange impressions from which he had suffered so much were, however, desultory and faint, insomuch that often he really could not, to his own satisfaction, distinguish between them and the mere suggestions of an excited imagination. One evening he walked down to the House of Commons with a Mr. Norcott, a member. As they walked down together, he was observed to become absent and silent, and to a degree so marked as scarcely to consist with good breeding, and this, in one who was obviously in all his habits so perfectly a gentleman, seemed to argue the pressure of some urgent and absorbing anxiety. It was afterwards known that during the whole of that walk he had heard the well-known footsteps dogging him as he proceeded. This, however, was the last time he suffered from this phase of the persecution of which he was already the anxious victim. A new and a very different one was about to be presented. Of the new series of impressions which were afterwards gradually to work out his destiny, that evening disclosed the first, and but for its relation to the train of events which followed, the incident would scarcely have been remembered by anyone. As they were walking in at the passage, a man of whom his friend could afterwards remember only that he was short in stature, looked like a foreigner, and wore a kind of travelling cap, walked very rapidly, and as if under some fierce excitement directly towards them, muttering to himself fast and vehemently the while. This odd-looking person proceeded straight toward Barton, who was foremost, and halted, regarding him for a moment or two with a look of menace and fury almost maniacal. And then, turning about as abruptly, he walked before them at the same agitated pace and disappeared by a side passage. Norcott distinctly remembered being a good deal shocked at the countenance and bearing of this man, which indeed irresistibly impressed him with an undefined sense of danger, such as he never felt before or since from the presence of anything human. But these sensations were far from amounting to anything so disconcerting as to flurry or excite him. He had seen only a singularly evil countenance, agitated, as it seemed, with the excitement of madness. He was absolutely astonished, however, at the effect of this apparition upon Captain Barton. He knew him to be a man of proved courage and coolness in real danger, a circumstance which made his conduct upon this occasion the more conspicuously odd. He recoiled a step or two as the stranger advanced, and clutched his companion's arm in silence, with a spasm of agony or terror, and then, as the figure disappeared, shoving him roughly back, he followed it for a few paces, stopped in great disorder, and sat down upon a form. A countenance more ghastly and haggard it was impossible to fancy. "For God's sake, Barton, what is the matter?" said Norcott, really alarmed at his friend's appearance. "You're not hurt, are you, nor unwell? What is it?" "What did he say? I did not hear it. What was it?" asked Barton, wholly disregarding the question. "Tut, tut, nonsense," said Norcott, greatly surprised. "Who cares what the fellow said? You are unwell, Barton, decidedly unwell. Let me call a coach." "Unwell? Yes, no, not exactly unwell," he said, evidently making an effort to recover his self-possession. "But to say the truth, I am fatigued, a little overworked, and perhaps over-anxious. You know I have been in Chancery, and the winding up of a suit is always a nervous affair. I have felt uncomfortable all this evening, but I am better now. Come, come, shall we go on?" No, take my advice, Barton, and go home. You really do need rest. You are looking absolutely ill. I really do insist on your allowing me to see you home," replied his companion. It was obvious that Barton was not himself disinclined to be persuaded. He accordingly took his leave, politely declining his friend's offered escort. Notwithstanding the few commonplace regrets which Norcott had expressed, it was plain that he was just as little deceived as Barton himself by the extempore plea of illness with which he had accounted for the strange exhibition, and that he even then suspected some lurking mystery in the matter. Norcott called next day at Barton's lodgings to inquire for him, and learned from the servant that he had not left his room since his return the night before, but that he was not seriously indisposed, and hoped to be out again in a few days. That evening he sent for Dr. Richards, then in large and fashionable practice in Dublin, and their interview was, it is said, an odd one. He entered into a detail of his own symptoms in an abstracted and desultory kind of way, which seemed to argue a strange want of interest in his own cure, and at all events made it manifest that there was some topic engaging his mind of more engrossing importance than his present ailment. He complained of occasional palpitations and headache. Dr. Richards asked him, among other questions, whether there was any irritating circumstance or anxiety to account for it. This he denied quickly and peevishly, and the physician thereupon declared his opinion that there was nothing amiss except some slight derangement of the digestion, for which he accordingly wrote a prescription, and was about to withdraw when Mr. Barton, with the air of a man who suddenly recollects a topic which had nearly escaped him, recalled him. "I beg your pardon, doctor, but I had really almost forgot. Will you permit me to ask you 2 or 3 medical questions? Rather odd ones, perhaps, but as a wager depends upon their solution, you will, I hope, excuse my unreasonableness." The physician readily undertook to satisfy the inquirer. Barton seemed to have some difficulty about opening the proposed interrogatories, for he was silent for a minute, then walked to his bookcase and returned as he had gone. At last he sat down and said, "You'll think them very childish questions, but I can't recover my wager without a decision, so I must put them. I want to know first about lockjaw. If a man actually has had that complaint and appears to have died of it, so that in fact a physician of average skill pronounces him actually dead, may he, after all, recover?" Dr. Richards smiled and shook his head. But a blunder may be made," resumed Barton. "Suppose an ignorant pretender to medical skill. May he be so deceived by any stage of the complaint as to mistake what is only a part of the progress of the disease for death itself?" "No one who had ever seen death," answered he, "could mistake it in the case of lockjaw." Barton mused for a few minutes. "I am going to ask you a question, perhaps still more childish. But first tell me, are not the regulations of foreign hospitals, such as those of, let us say, Lisbon, very lax and bungling? May not all kinds of blunders and slips occur in their entries of names and so forth?" Dr. Richards professed his inability to answer that query. "Well then, Doctor, here is the last of my questions. You will probably laugh at it, but it must out nevertheless. Is there any disease in all the range of human maladies which would have the effect of perceptibly contracting the stature and the whole frame, causing the man to shrink in all his proportions, and yet to preserve his exact resemblance to himself in every particular, with the one exception, his height and bulk? Any disease, Mark, no matter how rare, how little believed in generally, which could possibly result in producing such an effect?" The physician replied with a smile and a very decided negative. "Tell me then," said Barton abruptly, "if a man be in reasonable fear of assault from a lunatic who is at large, can he not procure a warrant for his arrest and detention?" "Really, that is more a lawyer's question than one in my way," replied Dr. Richards, "but I believe on applying to a magistrate such a course would be directed." The physician then took his leave, but just as he reached the hall door, remembered that he had left his cane upstairs and returned. His reappearance was awkward, for a piece of paper, which he recognized as his own prescription, was slowly burning upon the fire, and Barton sitting close by with an expression of settled gloom and dismay. Dr. Richards had too much tact to appear to observe what presented itself, but he had seen quite enough to assure him that the mind, and not the body of Captain Barton, was in reality the seat of his sufferings. A few days afterwards, the following advertisement appeared in the Dublin newspapers. "If Sylvester Yelland, formerly a foremast man on board His Majesty's frigate Dolphin, or his nearest of kin, will apply to Mr. Robbery Smith, solicitor, at his office, Dame Street, he or they may hear of something greatly to his or their advantage. Admission may be had at any hour up to 12 o'clock at night for the next fortnight, should parties desire to avoid observation, and the strictest secrecy as to all communications intended to be confidential shall be honourably observed." The Dolphin, as we have mentioned, was the vessel which Captain Barton had commanded, and this circumstance, connected with the extraordinary exertions made by the circulation of handbills, etc., as well as by repeated advertisements to secure for this strange notice the utmost possible publicity, suggested to Dr. Richards the idea that Captain Barton's extreme uneasiness was somehow connected with the individual to whom the advertisement was addressed, and he himself the author of it. This, however, it is needless to add, was no more than a conjecture, no information whatsoever as to the real purpose of the advertisement itself was divulged by the agent, nor yet any hint as to who his employer might be. Mr. Barton, although he had latterly begun to earn for himself the character of a hypochondriac, was yet very far from deserving it, though by no means lively. He had yet naturally what are termed even spirits, and was not subject to continual depressions. He soon, therefore, began to return to his former habits, and one of the earliest symptoms of this healthier tone of spirits was his appearing at a grand dinner of the Freemasons, of which worthy fraternity he was himself a brother. Barton, who had been at first gloomy and abstracted, drank much more freely than was his wont, possibly with the purpose of dispelling his own secret anxieties, and under the influence of good wine and pleasant company became gradually, unlike his usual self, talkative and even noisy. It was under this unwonted excitement that he left his company at about 10:30, and as conviviality is a strong incentive to gallantry, It occurred to him to proceed forthwith to Lady Rochdale's and pass the remainder of the evening with her and his destined bride. Accordingly, he was soon at Blank Street and chatting gaily with the ladies. It is not to be supposed that Captain Barton had exceeded the limits which propriety prescribes to good fellowship. He had merely taken enough of wine to raise his spirits, without, however, in the least degree unsteadying his mind or affecting his manners. With this undue elevation of spirits had supervened an entire oblivion or contempt of those undefined apprehensions which had for so long weighed upon his mind and to a certain extent estranged him from society. But as the night wore away and his artificial gaiety began to flag, these painful feelings gradually intruded themselves again, and he grew abstracted and anxious as heretofore. He took his leave at length with an unpleasant foreboding of some coming mischief, and with a mind haunted with 1,000 mysterious apprehensions, such as, even while he acutely felt their pressure, he nevertheless inwardly strove or affected to contemn. It was his proud defiance of what he considered to be his own weakness which prompted him upon this occasion to the course which brought about the adventure which we are now about to relate. Mr. Barton might have easily called a coach, but he was conscious that his strong inclination to do so proceeded from no cause other than what he desperately persisted in representing to himself to be his own superstitious tremors. He might also have returned home by a route different from that against which he had been warned by his mysterious correspondent, but for the same reason he dismissed this idea also, and with a dogged and half-desperate resolution to force matters to a crisis of some kind, to see if there were any reality in the causes of his former suffering, and if not, satisfactorily to bring their delusiveness to the proof, he determined to follow precisely the course which he had trodden upon the night so painfully memorable in his own mind as that on which his strange persecution had commenced. Though, sooth to say, the pilot who for the first time steers his vessel under the muzzles of a hostile battery never felt his resolution more severely tasked than did Captain Barton as he breathlessly pursued this solitary path, a path which, spite of every effort of scepticism and reason, he felt to be, as respected him, infested by a malignant influence. He pursued his way steadily and rapidly, scarcely breathing from intensity of suspense. He, however, was troubled by no renewal of the dreaded footsteps, and was beginning to feel a return of confidence, as, more than 3/4 of the way being accomplished with impunity, he approached the long line of twinkling oil lamps which indicated the frequented streets. This feeling of self-congratulation was, however, but momentary. The report of a musket at some 200 yards behind him, and the whistle of a bullet close to his head, disagreeably and startlingly dispelled it. His first impulse was to retrace his steps in pursuit of the assassin, but the road on either side was, as we have said, embarrassed by the foundations of a street, beyond which extended waste fields full of rubbish and neglected lime and brick kilns, and all now as utterly silent as though no sound had ever disturbed their dark and unsightly solitude. The futility of attempting, single-handed under such circumstances, a search for the murderer was apparent, especially as no further sound whatever was audible to direct his pursuit. With the tumultuous sensations of one whose life had just been exposed to a murderous attempt, and whose escape has been the narrowest possible, Captain Barton turned, and without, however, quickening his pace actually to a run, hurriedly pursued his way. He had turned, as we have said, after a pause of a few seconds, and had just commenced his rapid retreat, when on a sudden he met the well-remembered little man in the fur cap. The encounter was but momentary. The figure was walking at the same exaggerated pace, and with the same strange air of menace as before, and as it passed him, he thought he heard it say in a furious whisper, "Still alive, still alive!" The state of Mr. Barton's spirits began now to work a corresponding alteration in his health and looks, and to such a degree that it was impossible that the change should escape general remark. For some reasons known but to himself, he took no step whatsoever to bring the attempt upon his life, which he had so narrowly escaped, under the notice of the authorities, On the contrary, he kept it jealously to himself, and it was not for many weeks after the occurrence that he mentioned it, and then, in strict confidence to a gentleman, the torments of his mind at last compelled him to consult a friend. Spite of his blue devils, however, poor Barton, having no satisfactory reason to render to the public for any undue remissness in the attentions which his relation to Miss Montague required, was obliged to exert himself and present to the world a confident and cheerful bearing. The true source of his sufferings, and every circumstance connected with them, he guarded with a reserve so jealous that it seemed dictated by at least a suspicion that the origin of his strange persecution was known to himself, and that it was of a nature which, upon his own account, he could not or dare not disclose. The mind thus turned in upon itself, and constantly occupied with a haunting anxiety which it dared not reveal or confide to any human breast, became daily more excited, and of course more vividly impressible by a system of attack which operated through the nervous system, and in this state he was destined to sustain, with increasing frequency, these stealthy visitations of that apparition, which from the first had seemed to possess so unearthly and terrible a hold upon his imagination. It was about this time that Captain Barton called upon the then celebrated preacher, Dr. Macklin, with whom he had a slight acquaintance, and an extraordinary conversation ensued. The divine was seated in his chambers in college, surrounded with works upon his favourite pursuit, and deep in theology, when Barton was announced. There was something at once embarrassed and excited in his manner, which, along with his wan and haggard countenance, impressed the student with the unpleasant consciousness that his visitor must have recently suffered terribly indeed to account for an alteration so striking, so shocking. After the usual interchange of polite greeting and a few commonplace remarks, Captain Barton, who obviously perceived the surprise which his visit had excited, and which Dr. Macklin was unable wholly to conceal, interrupted a brief pause by remarking, "This is a strange call, Dr. Macklin, perhaps scarcely warranted by an acquaintance so slight as mine with you. I should not, under ordinary circumstances, have ventured to disturb you, but my visit is neither an idle nor impertinent intrusion. I am sure you will not so account it when—" Dr. Macklin interrupted him with assurances such as good breeding suggested, and Barton resumed, "I am come to task your patience by asking your advice. When I say your patience, I might indeed say more. I might have said your humanity, your compassion, for I have been and am a great sufferer." "My dear sir," replied the churchman, "it will indeed afford me infinite gratification if I can give you comfort in any distress of mind, but—" "I know what you would say," resumed Barton quickly. "I am an unbeliever, and therefore incapable of deriving help from religion, but don't take that for granted. At least you must not assume that, however unsettled my convictions may be, I do not feel a very deep interest in the subject. Circumstances have lately forced it upon my attention in such a way as to compel me to review the whole question in a more candid and teachable spirit, I believe, than I ever studied it in before." "Your difficulties, I take it for granted, refer to the evidences of revelation," suggested the clergyman. "Why, no, yes, in fact I am ashamed to say I have not considered even my objections sufficiently to state them connectedly. But there is one subject on which I feel a peculiar interest." He paused again, and Dr. Macklin pressed him to proceed. "The fact is," said Barton, "whatever may be my uncertainty as to the authenticity of what we are taught to call revelation, of one fact I am deeply and horribly convinced, that there does exist beyond this a spiritual world, a system whose workings are generally in mercy hidden from us, a system which may be, and which is sometimes partially and terribly revealed. I am sure I know," continued Barton with increasing excitement, "there is a God, a dreadful God, and that retribution follows guilt, in ways the most mysterious and stupendous, by agencies the most inexplicable and terrific. There is a spiritual system, great heavens, how frightfully I have been convinced, a system malignant and inexorable and omnipotent, under whose persecutions I am and have been suffering the torments of the damned. Yes, sir, yes, the fires and frenzy of hell. As Barton continued, his agitation became so vehement that the divine was shocked and even alarmed. The wild and excited rapidity with which he spoke, and above all the indefinable horror which stamped his features, afforded a contrast to his ordinary cool and unimpassioned self-possession, striking and painful in the last degree. "My dear sir," said Dr. Macklin after a brief pause, "I fear you have been suffering much indeed, but I venture to predict that the depression under which you labour will be found to originate in purely physical causes, and that with a change of air and the aid of a few tonics, your spirits will return, and the tone of your mind be once more cheerful and tranquil as heretofore." There was, after all, more truth than we are quite willing to admit in the classic theories which assigned the undue predominance of any one affection of the mind to the undue action or torpidity of one or other of our bodily organs. Believe me that a little attention to diet, exercise, and the other essentials of health, under competent direction, will make you as much yourself as you can wish. "Dr. Macklin," said Barton with something like a shudder, "I cannot delude myself with such a hope. I have no hope to cling to but one, and that is, that by some other spiritual agency more potent than that which tortures me, it may be combated, and I delivered. If this may not be, I am lost, now and for ever lost." "But, Mr. Barton, you must remember," urged his companion, "that others have suffered as you have done, and—" "No, no, no," interrupted he with irritability. "No, sir, I am not a credulous, far from a superstitious man. I have been, perhaps, too much the reverse, too sceptical, too slow of belief. But unless I were one whom no amount of evidence could convince, unless I were to contemn the repeated, the perpetual evidence of my own senses, I am now at last constrained to believe I have no escape from the conviction, the overwhelming certainty that I am haunted and dogged, go where I may, by a demon." There was an almost preternatural energy of horror in Barton's face, as, with its damp and death-like lineaments turned towards his companion, he thus delivered himself. "God help you, my poor friend," said Dr. Macklin, much shocked. "God help you, for indeed you are a sufferer, however your sufferings may have been caused." Aye, God help me," echoed Barton sternly. "But will he help me? Will he help me?" "Pray to him, pray in an humble and trusting spirit," said he. Pray, echoed he again. "I can't pray. I could as easily move a mountain by an effort of my will. I have not belief enough to pray. There is something within me that will not pray. You prescribe impossibilities, literal impossibilities." "You will not find it so if you will but try," said Dr. Macklin. "Try? I have tried, and the attempt only fills me with confusion and terror. I have tried in vain, and more than in vain. The awful, unutterable idea of eternity and infinity oppresses and maddens my brain whenever my mind approaches the contemplation of the Creator. I recoil from the effort, scared, confounded, terrified. I tell you, Dr. Macklin, if I am to be saved, it must be by other means. The idea of the Creator is to me intolerable. My mind cannot support it." "Say then, my dear sir," urged he, "say how you would have me serve you, what you would learn of me. What can I do or say to relieve you?" "Listen to me first," replied Captain Barton with a subdued air, and an evident effort to suppress his excitement. "Listen to me while I detail the circumstances of the terrible persecution under which my life has become all but intolerable. A persecution which has made me fear death and the world beyond the grave as much as I have grown to hate existence." Barton then proceeded to relate the circumstances which we have already detailed, and then continued. "This has now become habitual, an accustomed thing. I do not mean the actual seeing him in the flesh. Thank God that at least is not permitted daily. Thank God from the unutterable horrors of that visitation I have been mercifully allowed intervals of repose, though none of security. But from the consciousness that a malignant spirit is following and watching me wherever I go, I have never for a single instant a temporary respite. I am pursued with blasphemies, cries of despair, and appalling hatred. I hear those dreadful sounds called after me as I turn the corners of streets. They come in the night time while I sit in my chamber alone. They haunt me everywhere, charging me with hideous crimes and, great God, threatening me with coming vengeance and eternal misery. Hush! Do you hear that? He cried, with a horrible smile of triumph. There, will that convince you? The clergyman felt the chillness of horror irresistibly steal over him, while during the wail of a sudden gust of wind, he heard, or fancied he heard, the half-articulate sounds of rage and derision mingling in their sough. "Well, what do you think of that?" at length Barton cried, drawing a long breath through his teeth. "I heard the wind," said Dr. Macklin. "What should I think of it? What is there remarkable about it?" "The prince of the powers of the air," muttered Barton with a shudder. "Tut, tut, my dear sir," said the student with an effort to reassure himself, for though it was broad daylight, there was nevertheless something disagreeably contagious in the nervous excitement under which his visitor so obviously suffered. "You must not give way to those wild fancies. You must resist those impulses of the imagination." "Ay, resist the devil, and he will flee from thee," said Barton in the same tone. "But how resist him? Ay, there it is. There is the rub. What am I to do? What can I do?" "My dear sir, this is fancy," said the man of folios. "You are your own tormentor." No, sir, fancy has no part in it," answered Barton somewhat sternly. "Fancy, forsooth! Was it that made you as well as me here but this moment those appalling accents of hell? Fancy indeed, no. But you have seen this person frequently," said the ecclesiastic. "Why have you not accosted or secured him? Is it not somewhat precipitate, to say no more, to assume, as you have done, the existence of preternatural agency when, after all, everything may be easily accountable if only proper means were taken to sift the matter? There are circumstances connected with this appearance," said Barton, "which it were needless to disclose, but which to me are proofs of its horrible and unearthly nature. I know that the being who haunts me is not man. I say I know this. I could prove it to your own conviction." He paused for a minute and then added, "And as to accosting it, I dare not. I could not. When I see it, I am powerless. I stand in the gaze of death, in the triumphant presence of preterhuman power and malignity. My strength and faculties and memory all forsake me. O God, I fear, sir, you know not what you speak of. Mercy, heaven have pity on me." He leaned his elbow on the table and passed his hand across his eyes, as if to exclude some image of horror, muttering the last words of the sentence he had just concluded again and again. "Dr. Macklin," he said, abruptly raising himself and looking full upon the clergyman with an imploring eye, "I know you will do for me whatever may be done. You know now fully the circumstances and the nature of the mysterious agency of which I am the victim. I tell you I cannot help myself. I cannot hope to escape. I am utterly passive. I conjure you then to weigh my case well, and if anything may be done for me by vicarious supplication, by the intercession of the good, or by any aid or influence whatsoever, I implore of you, I adjure you in the name of the Most High, give me the benefit of that influence, deliver me from the body of this death, strive for me, pity me, I know you will. You cannot refuse this. It is the purpose and object of my visit. Send me away with some hope, however little, some faint hope of ultimate deliverance, and I will nerve myself to endure from hour to hour the hideous dream into which my existence is transformed." Dr. Macklin assured him that all he could do was to pray earnestly for him, and that so much he would not fail to do. They parted with a hurried and melancholy valediction. Barton hastened to the carriage which awaited him at the door, drew the blinds and drove away, while Dr. Macklin returned to his chamber to ruminate at leisure upon the strange interview which had just interrupted his studies. It was not to be expected that Captain Barton's changed and eccentric habits should long escape remark and discussion. Various were the theories suggested to account for it. Some attributed the alteration to the pressure of secret pecuniary embarrassments, others to a repugnance to fulfil an engagement into which he was presumed to have too precipitately entered, and others again to the supposed incipiency of mental disease, which latter indeed was the most plausible as well as the most generally received of the hypotheses circulated in the gossip of the day. From the very commencement of this change, at first so gradual in its advances, Miss Montague had, of course, been aware of it. The intimacy involved in their peculiar relation, as well as the near interest which it inspired, afforded, in her case, alike opportunity and motive for the successful exercise of that keen and penetrating observation peculiar to the sex. His visits became at length so interrupted, and his manner while they lasted so abstracted, strange, and agitated, that Lady Rochdale, after hinting her anxiety and her suspicions more than once, at length distinctly stated her anxiety and pressed for an explanation. The explanation was given, and although its nature at first relieved the worst solicitudes of the old lady and her niece, yet the circumstances which attended it, and the really dreadful consequences which it obviously threatened as regarded the spirits, and indeed the reason of the now wretched man who made the strange declaration, were enough, upon a little reflection, to fill their minds with perturbation and alarm. General Montague, the young lady's father, at length arrived. He had himself slightly known Barton some 10 or 12 years previously, and being aware of his fortune and connections, was disposed to regard him as an unexceptionable and indeed a most desirable match for his daughter. He laughed at the story of Barton's supernatural visitations, and lost not a moment in calling upon his intended son-in-law. "My dear Barton," he continued gaily after a little conversation, "my sister tells me that you are a victim to blue devils in quite a new and original shape." Barton changed countenance and sighed profoundly. "Come, come, I protest this will never do," continued the General. "You are more like a man on his way to the gallows than to the altar. These devils have made quite a saint of you." Barton made an effort to change the conversation. "No, no, it won't do," said his visitor, laughing. "I am resolved to say out what I have to say about this magnificent mock mystery of yours. Come, you must not be angry. But really it is too bad to see you at your time of life absolutely frightened into good behaviour, like a naughty child by a bugaboo, and, as far as I can learn, a very particularly contemptible one. Seriously though, my dear Barton, I have been a good deal annoyed at what they tell me, but at the same time thoroughly convinced that there is nothing in the matter that may not be cleared up, with just a little attention and management, within a week at furthest." "Ah, General, you do not know," he began. "Yes, but I do know quite enough to warrant my confidence," interrupted the soldier. "I know that all your annoyance proceeds from the occasional appearance of a certain little man in a cap and great coat, with a red vest and bad countenance, who follows you about, and pops upon you at the corners of lanes, and throws you into ague fits. Now, my dear fellow, I'll make it my business to catch this mischievous little mountebank, and either beat him into a jelly with my own hands, or have him whipped through the town at the cart's tail." "If you knew what I know," said Barton with gloomy agitation, "you would speak very differently. Don't imagine that I am so weak and foolish as to assume, without proof the most overwhelming, the conclusion to which I have been forced. The proofs are here, locked up here." As he spoke, he tapped upon his breast, and with an anxious sigh continued to walk up and down the room. "Well, well, Barton," said his visitor, "I'll wager a rump and a dozen I collar the ghost, and convince yourself before many days are over." He was running on in the same strain when he was suddenly arrested, and not a little shocked, by observing Barton, who had approached the window, stagger slowly back, like one who had received a stunning blow, his arm feebly extended towards the street, his face and his very lips white as ashes, while he uttered, "There, there, there." General Montague started mechanically to his feet, and from the window of the drawing-room saw a figure corresponding, as well as his hurry would permit him to discern, with the description of the person whose appearance so constantly and dreadfully disturbed the repose of his friend. The figure was just turning from the rails of the area upon which it had been leaning, and without waiting to see more, the old gentleman snatched his cane and hat and rushed down the stairs and into the street, in the furious hope of securing the person, and punishing the audacity of the mysterious stranger. He looked around him, but in vain, for any trace of the form he had himself distinctly beheld. He ran breathlessly to the nearest corner, expecting to see from thence the retreating figure, but no such form was visible. Back and forward, from crossing to crossing, he ran at fault, and it was not until the curious gaze and laughing countenances of the passers-by reminded him of the absurdity of his pursuit that he checked his hurried pace, lowered his walking cane from the menacing altitude which he had mechanically given it, adjusted his hat and walked composedly back again, inwardly vexed and flurried. He found Barton pale and trembling in every joint. They both remained silent, though under emotions very different. At last Barton whispered, "You saw it." "It? Him? Someone? You mean, to be sure I did," replied Montague testily. "But where is the good or the harm of seeing him? The fellow runs like a lamplighter. I wanted to catch him, but he had stolen away before I could reach the hall door. However, it is no great matter. Next time I dare say I'll do better. And, egad, if I once come within reach of him, I'll introduce his shoulders to the weight of my cane, in a way to make him cry peccavy." Notwithstanding General Montague's undertakings and exhortations, however, Barton continued to suffer from the selfsame unexplained cause. Go how, when, or where he would, he was still constantly dogged or confronted by the hateful being who had established over him so dreadful and mysterious an influence. Nowhere and at no time was he secure against the odious appearance which haunted him with such diabolical perseverance. His depression, misery, and excitement became more settled and alarming every day, and the mental agonies that ceaselessly preyed upon him began at last so sensibly to affect his general health that Lady Rochdale and General Montague succeeded, without indeed much difficulty, in persuading him to try a short tour on the continent, in the hope that an entire change of scene would at all events have the effect of breaking through the influences of local association, which the more sceptical of his friends assumed to be by no means inoperative in suggesting and perpetuating what they conceived to be a mere form of nervous illusion. General Montague, moreover, was persuaded that the figure which haunted his intended son-in-law was by no means the creation of his own imagination, but, on the contrary, a substantial form of flesh and blood, animated by a spiteful and obstinate resolution, perhaps with some murderous object in perspective, to watch and follow the unfortunate gentleman. Even this hypothesis was not a very pleasant one, yet it was plain that if Barton could once be convinced that there was nothing preternatural in the phenomenon which he had hitherto regarded in that light, the affair would lose all its terrors in his eyes, and wholly cease to exercise upon his health and spirits the baneful influence which it had hitherto done. He therefore reasoned that if the annoyance were actually escaped from by mere change of scene, it obviously could not have originated in any supernatural agency. Yielding to their persuasions, Barton left Dublin for England, accompanied by General Montague. They posted rapidly to London and thence to Dover, whence they took the packet with a fair wind for Calais. The General's confidence in the result of the expedition on Barton's spirits had risen day by day since their departure from the shores of Ireland, for to the inexpressible relief and delight of the latter, he had not, since then, so much as even once fancied a repetition of those impressions which had, when at home, drawn him gradually down to the very abyss of horror and despair. This exemption from what he had begun to regard as the inevitable condition of his existence, and the sense of security which began to pervade his mind, were inexpressibly delightful, and in the exultation of what he considered his deliverance, he indulged in 1,000 happy anticipations for a future into which so lately he had hardly dared to look. In short, both he and his companions secretly congratulated themselves upon the termination of that persecution which had been to its immediate victim a source of such unspeakable agony. It was a beautiful day, and a crowd of idlers stood upon the jetty to receive the packet and enjoy the bustle of the new arrivals. Montague walked a few paces in advance of his friend. and as he made his way through the crowd, a little man touched his arm and said to him in a broad provincial patois, "Monsieur is walking too fast. He will lose his sick comrade in the throng, for by my faith the poor gentleman seems to be fainting." Montague turned quickly and observed that Barton did indeed look deadly pale. He hastened to his side. "My poor fellow, are you ill?" he asked anxiously. The question was unheeded and twice repeated ere Barton stammered, "I saw him! I saw him!" "Him? Who? Where? When did you see him? Where is he?" cried Montague, looking around him. "I saw him, but he is gone," repeated Barton faintly. "But where? Where? For God's sake speak," urged Montague vehemently. "It is but this moment here," said he. "But what did he look like? What had he on? What did he wear?" "Quick, quick," urged his excited companion, ready to dart among the crowd and collar the delinquent on the spot. "He touched your arm. He spoke to you. He pointed to me. God be merciful to me. There is no escape," said Barton, in the low, subdued tones of intense despair. Montague had already bustled away in all the flurry of mingled hope and indignation, but though the singular personnel of the stranger who had accosted him was vividly and perfectly impressed upon his recollection, he failed to discover among the crowd even the slightest resemblance to him. After a fruitless search, in which he enlisted the services of several of the bystanders, who aided all the more zealously as they believed he had been robbed, he at length, out of breath and baffled, gave over the attempt. "Ah, my friend, it won't do," said Barton, with the faint voice and bewildered, ghastly look of one who has been stunned by some mortal shock. "There is no use in contending with it. Whatever it is, the dreadful association between me and it is now established. I shall never escape, never, never." "Nonsense, nonsense, my dear fellow, don't talk so," said Montague, with something at once of irritation and dismay. "You must not. Never mind, I say, never mind. We'll jockey the scoundrel yet." It was, however, but lost labour to endeavour henceforward to inspire Barton with one ray of hope. He became utterly desponding. This intangible and, as it seemed, utterly inadequate influence was fast destroying his energies of intellect, character, and health. His first object was now to return to Ireland, there, as he believed, and now almost hoped, speedily to die. To Ireland, accordingly, he came, and one of the first faces he saw upon the shore was again that of his implacable and dreaded persecutor. Barton seemed at last to have lost not only all enjoyment and every hope in existence, but all independence of will besides. He now submitted himself passively to the management of the friends most nearly interested in his welfare. With the apathy of entire despair, he implicitly assented to whatever measures they suggested and advised, and as a last resource, it was determined to remove him to a house of Lady Rochdale's in the neighbourhood of Clontarf, where, with the advice of his medical attendant, who persisted in his opinion that the whole train of impressions resulted merely from some nervous derangement, it was resolved that he was to confine himself strictly to the house, and to make use only of those apartments which commanded a view of an enclosed yard, the gates of which were to be kept jealously locked. These precautions would at least secure him against the casual appearance of any living form which his excited imagination might possibly confound with the spectre which, as it was contended, his fancy recognized in every figure that bore even a distant or general resemblance to the traits with which he had at first invested it. A month or 6 weeks' absolute seclusion under these conditions, it was hoped, might, by interrupting the series of these terrible impressions, gradually dispel the predisposing apprehension and effectually break up the associations which had confirmed the supposed disease and rendered recovery hopeless. Cheerful society and that of his friends was to be constantly supplied, and on the whole very sanguine expectations were indulged in that under this treatment the obstinate hypochondria of the patient might at length give way. Accompanied therefore by Lady Rochdale, General Montague and his daughter, his own affianced bride, poor Barton, himself never daring to cherish a hope of his ultimate emancipation from the strange horrors under which his life was literally wasting away, took possession of the apartments whose situation, protected him against the dreadful intrusions from which he shrank with such unutterable terror. After a little time, a steady persistence in this system began to manifest its results in a very marked though gradual improvement alike in the health and spirits of the invalid. Not indeed that anything at all approaching to complete recovery was yet discernible. On the contrary, to those who had not seen him since the commencement of his strange sufferings, such an alteration would have been apparent as might well have shocked them. The improvement, however, such as it was welcomed with gratitude and delight, especially by the poor young lady whom her attachment to him, as well as her now singularly painful position, consequent on his mysterious and protracted illness, rendered an object of pity scarcely 1 degree less to be commiserated than himself. A week passed, a fortnight, a month, and yet no recurrence of the hated visitation had agitated and terrified him as before. The treatment had so far been followed by complete success. The chain of association had been broken. The constant pressure upon the overtasked spirits had been removed, and under these comparatively favourable circumstances, the sense of social community with the world about him and something of human interest, if not of enjoyment, began to reanimate his mind. It was about this time that Lady Rochdale, who, like most old ladies of the day, was deep in family receipts and a great pretender to medical science, being engaged in the concoction of certain unpalatable mixtures of marvellous virtue, dispatched her own maid to the kitchen garden with a list of herbs, which were there to be carefully culled and brought back to her for the purpose stated. The handmaiden, however, returned with her task scarce half completed, and a good deal flurried and alarmed. Her mode of accounting for her precipitate retreat and evident agitation was odd, and to the old lady unpleasantly startling. It appeared that she had repaired to the kitchen garden, pursuant to her mistress's directions, and had there begun to make the specified selection among the rank and neglected herbs, which crowded one corner of the enclosure, and while engaged in this pleasant labour she carelessly sang a fragment of an old song, as she said, to keep herself company. She was, however, interrupted by a sort of mocking echo of the air she was singing, and looking up she saw through the old thorn hedge, which surrounded the garden, a singularly ill-looking little man, whose countenance wore the stamp of menace and malignity, standing close to her at the other side of the hawthorn screen. She described herself as utterly unable to move or speak, while he charged her with a message for Captain Barton, the substance of which she distinctly remembered to have been to the effect that he, Captain Barton, must come abroad as usual and show himself to his friends out of doors, or else prepare for a visit in his own chamber. On concluding this brief message, the stranger had, with a threatening air, got down into the outer ditch, and seizing the hawthorn stems in his hands, seemed on the point of climbing through the fence, a feat which might have been accomplished without much difficulty. Without, of course, awaiting this result, the girl, throwing down her treasures of thyme and rosemary, had turned and run with the swiftness of terror to the house. Lady Rochdale commanded her, on pain of instant dismissal, to observe an absolute silence respecting all that portion of the incident which related to Captain Barton, and at the same time directed instant search to be made by her men in the garden and fields adjacent. This measure, however, was attended with the usual unsuccess, and filled with fearful and indefinable misgivings, Lady Rochdale communicated the incident to her brother. The story, however, until long afterwards, went no further, and of course it was jealously guarded from Barton, who continued to mend, though slowly and imperfectly. Barton now began to walk occasionally in the courtyard which we have mentioned, and which, being surrounded by a high wall, commanded no view beyond its own extent. Here he, therefore, considered himself perfectly secure, and but for a careless violation of orders by one of the grooms, he might have enjoyed, at least for some time longer, his much prized immunity. Opening upon the public road, this yard was entered by a wooden gate, with a wicket in it, which was further defended by an iron gate upon the outside. Strict orders had been given to keep them carefully locked, but in spite of these, it had happened that one day, as Barton was slowly pacing this narrow enclosure, In his accustomed walk, and reaching the further extremity, was turning to retrace his steps. He saw the boarded wicket ajar and the face of his tormentor immovably looking at him through the iron bars. For a few seconds he stood riveted to the earth, breathless and bloodless, in the fascination of that dreaded gaze, and then fell helplessly upon the pavement. There was he found a few minutes afterwards, and conveyed to his room, the apartment which he was never afterwards to leave alive. Henceforward a marked and unaccountable change was observable in the tone of his mind. Captain Barton was now no longer the excited and despairing man he had been before. A strange alteration had passed upon him. An unearthly tranquillity reigned in his mind. It was the anticipated stillness of the grave. "Montague, my friend, this struggle is nearly ended now," he said tranquilly, but with a look of fixed and fearful awe. "I have at last some comfort from that world of spirits from which my punishment has come. I know now that my sufferings will be soon over." Montague pressed him to speak on. "Yes," said he in a softened voice, "my punishment is nearly ended. From sorrow perhaps I shall never in time or eternity escape, but my agony is almost over. Comfort has been revealed to me, and what remains of my allotted struggle I will bear with submission, even with hope." "I am glad to hear you speak so tranquilly, my dear fellow," said Montague. "Peace and cheerfulness of mind are all you need to make you what you were." "No, no, I never can be that," said he mournfully. "I am no longer fit for life. I am soon to die. I do not shrink from death as I did. I am to see him but once again, and then all is ended." "He said so then," suggested Montague. "He? No, no, good tidings could scarcely come through him, and these were good and welcome, and they came so solemnly and sweetly, with unutterable love and melancholy, such as I could not, without saying more than is needful or fitting of other long past scenes and persons, fully explain to you." As Barton said this, he shed tears. "Come, come," said Montague, mistaking the source of his emotions, "you must not give way. What is it, after all, but a pack of dreams and nonsense, or at worst the practices of a scheming rascal that enjoys his power of playing upon your nerves and loves to exert it, a sneaking vagabond that owes you a grudge and pays it off this way, not daring to try a more manly one?" "A grudge indeed he owes me, you say rightly," said Barton with a sullen shudder. "A grudge as you call it. O God, when the justice of heaven permits the evil one to carry out a scheme of vengeance, when its execution is committed to the lost and frightful victim of sin, who owes his own ruin to the man, the very man, whom he is commissioned to pursue, then indeed the torments and terrors of hell are anticipated on earth. But heaven has dealt mercifully with me. Hope has opened to me at last, and if death could come without the dreadful sight I am doomed to see, I would gladly close my eyes this moment upon the world. But though death is welcome, I shrink with an agony you cannot understand, a maddening agony, an actual frenzy of terror, from the last encounter with that demon who has drawn me thus to the verge of the chasm, and who is himself to plunge me down. I am to see him again once more, but under circumstances unutterably more terrific than ever." As Barton thus spoke, he trembled so violently that Montague was really alarmed at the extremity of his sudden agitation, and hastened to lead him back to the topic which had before seemed to exert so tranquilizing an effect upon his mind. "It was not a dream," he said after a time. "I was in a different state. I felt differently and strangely, and yet it was all as real, as clear and vivid, as what I now see and hear. It was a reality." "And what did you see and hear?" urged his companion. "When I awakened from the swoon I fell into on seeing him," said Barton, continuing, as if he had not heard the question. "It was slowly, very slowly. I was reclining by the margin of a broad lake, surrounded by misty hills, and a soft, melancholy, rose-coloured light illuminated it all. It was indescribably sad and lonely, and yet more beautiful than any earthly scene. My head was leaning on the lap of a girl, and she was singing a strange and wondrous song that told, I know not how, whether by words or harmony, of all my life, all that is past, and all that is still to come. And with the song, the old feelings that I thought had perished within me came back, and tears flowed from my eyes, partly for the song and its mysterious beauty, and partly for the unearthly sweetness of her voice. Yet I know the voice, oh how well, and I was spellbound as I listened and looked at the strange and solitary scene, without stirring, almost without breathing, and alas, alas, without turning my eyes towards the face that I knew was near me. So sweetly powerful was the enchantment that held me. And so, slowly and softly, the song and scene grew fainter, and ever fainter, to my senses, till all was dark and still again. And then I wakened to this world, as you saw, comforted, for I knew that I was forgiven much. Barton wept again long and bitterly. From this time, as we have said, the prevailing tone of his mind was one of profound and tranquil melancholy. This, however, was not without its interruptions. He was thoroughly impressed with the conviction that he was to experience another and a final visitation, illimitably transcending in horror all he had before experienced. From this anticipated and unknown agony, he often shrunk in such paroxysms of abject terror and distraction as filled the whole household with dismay and superstitious panic. Even those among them who affected to discredit the supposition of preternatural agency in the matter were often in their secret souls visited during the darkness and solitude of night with qualms and apprehensions which they would not have readily confessed, and none of them attempted to dissuade Barton from the resolution on which he now systematically acted of shutting himself up in his own apartment. The window blinds of this room were kept jealously down, and his own man was seldom out of his presence day or night, his bed being placed in the same chamber. This man was an attached and respectable servant, and his duties, in addition to those ordinarily imposed upon valets, but which Barton's independent habits generally dispensed with, were to attend carefully to these simple precautions by means of which his master hoped to exclude the dreaded intrusion of the watcher, as the strange letter he had at first received had designated his persecutor. And in addition to attending to these arrangements, which consisted merely in anticipating the possibility of his master's being, through any unscreened window or open door, exposed to the dreaded influence, the valet was never to suffer him to be for one moment alone. Total solitude, even for a minute, had become to him now almost as intolerable as the idea of going abroad into the public ways. It was an instinctive anticipation of what was coming. It is needless to say that under these mysterious and horrible circumstances, no steps were taken toward the fulfillment of that engagement into which he had entered. There was quite disparity enough in point of years, and indeed of habits, between the young lady and Captain Barton to have precluded anything like very vehement or romantic attachment on her part. Though grieved and anxious, therefore, she was very far from being heartbroken, a circumstance which, for the sentimental purposes of our tale, is much to be deplored. But truth must be told, especially in a narrative whose chief, if not only pretensions to interest, consist in a rigid adherence to facts, or what are so reported to have been. Miss Montague, nevertheless, devoted much of her time to a patient but fruitless attempt to cheer the unhappy invalid. She read for him and conversed with him, but it was apparent that whatever exertions he made, the endeavour to escape from the one constant and ever-present fear that preyed upon him was utterly and miserably unavailing. Young ladies, as all the world knows, are much given to the cultivation of pets, and among those who shared the favour of Miss Montague was a fine old owl, which the gardener, who caught him napping among the ivy of a ruined stable, had dutifully presented to that young lady. The caprice which regulates such preferences was manifested in the extravagant favour with which this grim and ill-favoured bird was at once distinguished by his mistress, and trifling as this whimsical circumstance may seem, I am forced to mention it inasmuch as it is connected, oddly enough, with the concluding scene of the story. Barton, so far from sharing in this liking for the new favourite, regarded it from the first with an antipathy as violent as it was utterly unaccountable. Its very vicinity was insupportable to him. He seemed to hate and dread it with a vehemence absolutely laughable, and to those who have never witnessed the exhibition of antipathies of this kind, his dread would seem all but incredible. With these few words of preliminary explanation, I shall proceed to state the particulars of the last scene in this strange series of incidents. It was almost 2 o'clock one winter's night, and Barton was as usual at that hour in his bed. The servant we have mentioned occupied a smaller bed in the same room, and a candle was burning. The man was on a sudden aroused by his master, who said, "I can't get it out of my head that accursed bird has escaped somehow, and is lurking in some corner of the room. I have been dreaming of him. Get up, Smith, and look about, search for him. Such hateful dreams." The servant rose and examined the chamber, and while engaged in so doing, he heard the well-known sound, more like a long-drawn gasp than a hiss, with which these birds from their secret haunts affright the quiet of the night. This ghostly indication of its proximity, for the sound proceeded from the passage upon which Barton's chamber door opened, determined the search of the servant, who, opening the door, proceeded a step or two forward for the purpose of driving the bird away. He had, however, hardly entered the lobby when the door behind him slowly swung to under the impulse, as it seemed, of some gentle current of air. But as immediately over the door there was a kind of window intended in the daytime to aid in lighting the passage, and through which the rays of the candle were then issuing, the valet could see quite enough for his purpose. As he advanced, he heard his master, who, lying in a well-curtained bed, had not, as it seemed, perceived his exit from the room, call him by name, and direct him to place the candle on the table by his bed. The servant, who was now some way in the long passage, did not like to raise his voice for the purpose of replying, lest he should startle the sleeping inmates of the house, began to walk hurriedly and softly back again, when, to his amazement, he heard a voice in the interior of the chamber answering calmly, and the man actually saw, through the window which overtopped the door, that the light was slowly shifting, as if carried across the chamber in answer to his master's call. Palsied by a feeling akin to terror, yet not unmingled with a horrible curiosity, he stood breathless and listening at the threshold, unable to summon resolution to push open the door and enter. Then came a rustling of the curtains, and a sound like that of one who in a low voice hushes a child to rest, in the midst of which he heard Barton say in a tone of stifled horror, "Oh God! Oh my God!" and repeat the same exclamation several times. Then ensued a silence, which again was broken by the same strange soothing sound, and at last there burst forth in one swelling peal a yell of agony so appalling and hideous that, under some impulse of ungovernable horror, the man rushed to the door, and with his whole strength strove to force it open. Whether it was that, in his agitation, he had himself but imperfectly turned the handle, or that the door was really secured upon the inside, he failed to effect an entrance. And as he tugged and pushed, yell after yell rang louder and wilder through the chamber, accompanied all the while by the same hushing sounds. Actually freezing with terror, and scarce knowing what he did, the man turned and ran down the passage, wringing his hands in the extremity of horror and irresolution. At the stairhead he was encountered by General Montague, scared and eager, and just as they met the fearful sounds had ceased. "What is it? Where is your master?" said Montague with the incoherence of extreme agitation. "Has anything, for God's sake, is anything wrong?" "Lord have mercy on us, it's all over," said the man, staring wildly towards his master's chamber. "He's dead, sir. I'm sure he's dead." Without waiting for inquiry or explanation, Montague, closely followed by the servant, hurried to the chamber door, turned the handle, and pushed it open. As the door yielded to his pressure, the ill-omened bird of which the servant had been in search, uttering its spectral warning, started suddenly from the far side of the bed, and flying through the doorway close over their heads, and extinguishing in its passage the candle which Montague carried, crashed through the skylight that overlooked the lobby, and sailed away into the darkness of the outer space. "There it is, God bless us," whispered the man, after a breathless pause. "Curse that bird," muttered the general, startled by the suddenness of the apparition, and unable to conceal his discomposure. "The candle was moved," said the man after another breathless pause. "See, they put it by the bed." "Draw the curtains, fellow, and don't stand gaping there," whispered Montague sternly. The man hesitated. "Hold this, then," said Montague impatiently, thrusting the candlestick into the servant's hand, and himself advancing to the bedside, he drew the curtains apart. The light of the candle, which was still burning at the bedside, fell upon a figure huddled together and half upright at the head of the bed. It seemed as though it had shrunk back as far as the solid panelling would allow, and the hands were still clutched in the bedclothes. "Barton, Barton, Barton!" cried the general with a strange mixture of awe and vehemence. He took the candle and held it so that it shone full upon his face. The features were fixed, stern and white. The jaw was fallen, and the sightless eyes, still open, gazed vacantly forward towards the front of the bed. "God Almighty, he's dead!" muttered the general, as he looked upon this fearful spectacle. They both continued to gaze upon it in silence for a minute or more. "And cold too," said Montague, withdrawing his hand from that of the dead man. "And see, may I never have life, sir," added the man after another pause with a shudder. "But there was something else on the bed with him. Look there, see that, sir." As the man thus spoke, he pointed to a deep indenture, as if caused by a heavy pressure near the foot of the bed. Montague was silent. "Come, sir, come away, for God's sake," whispered the man, drawing close up to him and holding fast by his arm while he glanced fearfully round. "What good can be done here now? Come away, for God's sake." At this moment they heard the steps of more than one approaching, and Montague, hastily desiring the servant to arrest their progress, endeavoured to loose the rigid grip with which the fingers of the dead man were clutched in the bedclothes, and drew, as well as he was able, the awful figure into a reclining posture. Then, closing the curtains carefully upon it, he hastened himself to meet those who were approaching. It is needless to follow the personages so slightly connected with this narrative into the events of their after-lives. It is enough for us to remark that no clue to the solution of these mysterious occurrences was ever afterwards discovered, and so long an interval having now passed, it is scarcely to be expected that time can throw any new light upon their inexplicable obscurity. Until the secrets of the earth shall be no longer hidden, these transactions must remain shrouded in mystery. The only occurrence in Captain Barton's former life to which reference was ever made as having any possible connection with the sufferings with which his existence closed, and which he himself seemed to regard as working out a retribution for some grievous sin of his past life, was a circumstance which not for several years after his death was brought to light. The nature of this disclosure was painful to his relatives and discreditable to his memory. It appeared then that some 8 years before Captain Barton's final return to Dublin, he had formed in the town of Plymouth a guilty attachment, the object of which was the daughter of one of the ship's crew under his command. The father had visited the frailty of his unhappy child with extreme harshness and even brutality, and it was said that she had died heartbroken. Presuming upon Barton's implication in her guilt, this man had conducted himself towards him with marked insolence, and Barton resented this, and what he resented with still more exasperated bitterness, his treatment of the unfortunate girl, by a systematic exercise of those terrible and arbitrary severities with which the regulations of the Navy arm those who are responsible for its discipline. The man had at length made his escape while the vessel was in port at Lisbon, but died, as it was said, in an hospital in that town of the wounds inflicted in one of his recent and sanguinary punishments. Whether these circumstances in reality bear or not upon the occurrences of Barton's afterlife, it is of course impossible to say. It seems, however, more than probable that they were, at least in his own mind, closely associated with them. But however the truth may be as to the origin and motives of this mysterious persecution, there can be no doubt that, with respect to the agencies by which it was accomplished, absolute and impenetrable mystery is like to prevail until the day of doom. The End.